I'm Rob Licuria, Senior Editor at Gold Derby, here with Kamau Bell, host and producer of CNN's documentary series United Shades of America. First of all, congratulations on your Emmy nomination.
Thank you. It's a lot of things going on this year, so you sort of forget that things like this can happen. Not that I didn't wake up on that day and check and refresh my browser every few minutes, but it is a nice, fun thing in the middle of kind of a lot going on.
Absolutely. I think, it's a really interesting category. There's so much great material on TV these days. Like, honestly, to even be considered is such a great thing. But look, you've won three Emmys today yourself, and also I think two other editing Emmys. This show is no slouch. So I think the other shows need to be worried about you.
Let's be clear. If I'm totally prepared to lose to Oprah Winfrey, I think my mom would be mad if I beat Oprah Winfrey for an Emmy. So I think and I also feel like if I win over Oprah, that's probably not a good look. So I'm just prepared to like to lose to Oprah and the royal family.
Like, that's fair. I mean, I'm just checking the memo. Stanley Tucci's also wondering, what about me? But look, I think it's a
No,
very
Stanley Tucci. It's just, I mean, culturally, the Oprah thing, but also Stanley Tucci's a label mate, so he's the new guy in town. It's funny to think of Stanley Tucci as the underdog, but here we go. Yeah,
I know, right? It's insane. But
yeah.
yeah, so I think you guys should be super proud. There's a reason why you're in the running, and that's because the show is such quality. It talks about stuff that we sometimes hear about on in podcasts and other shows, but this show just does it with such a really interesting way. You're able to balance entertainment with also engaging us and kind of teaching us something, and that's no easy feat. I'm really interested to know what your thoughts are on that balance between not being so boring and preachy, but also giving us facts and kind of showing us, shining a light on things that we're not really aware of.
I mean, I think a lot of it comes from my childhood. I was a PBS kid because I'm at the age where that was the fourth channel. Like there was the networks and then there was PBS. And so certainly I think the DNA of United Shades comes through like Sesame Street and Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood and the Electric Company, and then all sort of like the PBS docuseries that I would watch later. And then I think so for me it was like it just is a part of what you do. It's fun to learn stuff, and it's more fun to learn stuff if you make it fun. So I think that was just what I enjoyed. And then I think, as I've said before, like I was a dude in my, I don't know, younger years. I don't know, in my sitting on my then girlfriend, now wife's couch watching Anthony Bourdain on the Travel Channel and just being like, how do you get a job like that? And having no sense that like 10 years later I would have a show that followed his show, or that I'd be working on a show that was like that. So I think it's just about the fact that I've always been attracted to that kind of content, and suddenly the universe of places you could do that stuff opened up. Because like I said, when I was a kid, it was basically just PBS, and now it's like everybody kind of wants a show like this now.
That's right. There are so many networks and channels out there, but CNN does a really great job of, obviously it's a news network, but it has a lot of really interesting infotainment, I guess you might want to call it, documentary series. Your show's obviously one of them. For people who aren't completely aware, obviously the series focuses on the experiences of maybe minority or marginalized communities across the country, whether that be Black Americans, Latinx communities, Native Americans, Asians, immigrants, and so forth, LGBTQ. So as you travel the country, I just wonder, how do you come up with the various topics for each season? Because you're contemplating and exposing a whole range of topics like social injustice and economic disparity, racism, prejudice. Is it difficult to narrow it down so that you can kind of really hit some really interesting things that are kind of hitting the zeitgeist in that particular year?
I mean, there's no shortage of topics to talk about, because I think when you start with like what are the communities in the United States of America that we haven't talked about enough? Well, that's really most of the communities in the United States of America. And, we just, because there's sort of a normalization of who we should be talking to. And so I think that's not the problem. The challenge is that we film the show over like 6 days. So you got to go to one place. Maybe you can go to two, but it's not like we're filming a doc that's going to travel around the country and follow and look at all these communities in different areas. So the biggest challenge is finding the one place that has all the stories. And luckily we have a team of producers who do all that work. And then once you find that place, the stories usually sort of come to you. If you can find people in that place who are like, I'm happy you're here, let me give you other people you should want to talk to, then everything opens up for us. So with the white supremacy episode, that is the one that was nominated, you know, we could do an episode about white supremacy literally in any city in America. Like, yay. But it was about where do we want to go that we're going to get new stories. And Pittsburgh was among the cities. And at some point I realized I actually know people in Pittsburgh. And that's what I think really sort of put it over the top, is that I know people we can connect with in Pittsburgh who will be able to who will be able to give us the story that we want to tell.
Yeah, see, like I've seen quite a few episodes and documentaries about white supremacy, but I've never quite seen it in this particular through this particular prism, which I found really interesting. I mean, you start off by saying, let's get real about white supremacy. And so then to me, it was a very unvarnished look at it without so much of the heated emotion behind it. You know, the very understandable heated emotion behind it. So when you're explaining this with a straight bat, and for example, you know, showing us an image of the iceberg and how it's a complicated system, a web of systemic power, I should say, with education, employment, incarceration, economics, representation, culture. How do you make sure that you're not getting too kind of emotional and just kind of giving us the facts with a straight bat?
I mean, that comes from being a stand-up comic, that like we're stand-up comics are about synthesizing either big stories into smaller things or lots of information into it, a small enough chunk that I can get you to the laugh. So I think a lot of that comes from the fact that having a life as a stand-up comic, I'm used to going like, wow, there's a lot here. What's the in? What's the way I can get into this? And also used to break it down on a level that everybody can understand it. Because as a stand-up comic, as much as it's fun when only one person in the audience laughs, you can't make a living off of one person in the audience laughing. So, you know, and it really is a back and forth with me and the producers. Like a lot of that stuff starts out a lot longer. And then literally the fact that the show has to be 42 minutes once you take the commercials out, you start to have to make some big cuts. And so there's things often that you're like, oh, it's really painful to cut this, but we don't have the real estate to do this. So it really, like, a lot of it is like knowing how to sort of zero in as the creator. And then a lot of it is just like, it's just the function of time. Like it's just we have to get to this deadline.
It's important that you choose from the outset a scenario or an environment that will help you tell the story. Pittsburgh, you mentioned, was what you chose for this episode. So interesting that, to me, it was a real eye-opener about the talk about this cycle of poverty. It never quite occurred to me that when communities inhabit these food, transport, and medical deserts, which was a great way of putting it in this episode, they're trapped, and so the cycle continues. And Pittsburgh's a great example of that, particularly because of the haves and the have-nots in that city. Was that an eye-opener for you, or was this just something that you were very much well aware of and you just wanted to shine a light on it?
No, I mean, the great thing about the show is I also get to spend time in cities and places that I don't spend a lot of time in. So I'd been to Pittsburgh twice as a comic, and you don't really see the city when you go as a comic. So I'd sort of like knew enough about it to know like sort of how it generally worked, but I didn't know the deep cuts. And like I said, I knew Jabari X, and I knew some people there. And I sort of knew that like I could talk, they would get me down to the root of the problem. But I think the thing that is most shocking about Pittsburgh is the fact that it's being pushed as like the best place in America to live, the most liberal place to be, the most progressive place to be. And yet it's also one of the hardest places for black women to live. So that dichotomy I didn't know about. And once we found that out, it was like, well, that's the place we got to go. Because again, it's a surprise. If you do an episode about white supremacy and you do it in Mississippi, a lot of people in America are going to be like, well, of course. But the fact is like, this is supposed to be a Midwestern city. It's supposed to be a liberal city. It's being trumpeted as a great place to live. And yet it's not for black people generally.
Absolutely. And that's what was such an eye-opener for me. And it also occurred to me, the episode aired last July, right in the thick of the then very divisive Trump administration. And back then, there was no sense that the election, what was going to happen and what was going to happen in January on the 6th. So it was interesting to go back to the old footage at the beginning with you and the KKK, which is still very confronting to watch, even after all this time. And then you go back, you talk about the less blatant, more systemic white supremacy that perhaps isn't glaringly obvious. Have you had still a lot of feedback about how you showed that dichotomy between the very obvious and the very kind of endemic, kind of under the surface white supremacy.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm walking through an airport or walking through a city and somebody recognizes me and says, "Oh, I know you," I generally know that I'm like, my favorite episode is, and I'm like, don't say KKK, don't the KKK episode. It's my hit single. It's the
Yeah.
one that So
Yeah.
it's and so this episode was in many ways like trying to go. That was one side of white supremacy. And I've learned over the course of this series, over the course of the last few years of living in America, that that's not the most harsh end of white supremacy generally. It is if it shows up on your front lawn, but generally your average black person is going to be able to steer clear of that kind of white supremacy. But you're not going to be able to steer clear of the medical industry or the prison system or the education system and how they are using white supremacy, or the media in your town and how that's operating through white supremacy. So for me, I really did think of this as a sequel to that episode, to go like, that's one way of looking at it. And I get that gets the clicks and the headlines, but this is actually the more interesting and more important way to look at it.
Yeah, and again, although I feel like I'm aware of some of the issues that you raised, putting it through that prism really showed me, as a viewer, that I always would think of the KKK immediately, or police brutality, like the really, really obvious stuff. The things that you shined a light on were just such an eye opener, and then it made me think of critical race theory, because it's just become such a big buzzword on the right these days, and not all of them, but generally I feel like it's been weaponized by right-wing media, particularly, and by a certain faction of politics. So it's also like wokeness. That's another thing that's been weaponized, unfortunately. How do you feel about that, especially given from your background as a documentary TV maker and host? How do you feel about how those terms have been weaponized by right-wing media?
I mean, it's funny. It just shows that like right wing media always needs a target, and they don't really necessarily care if the target is a real target, as long as it gets their audience fired up. So it's funny to me that wokeness has been talked about a lot, because black people have been done with wokeness since about 2017. We were like, it was fun. Like that's not really. Yeah, that's not really it. All wokeness was a way to describe something that black people have always dealt with. It's good to be smart and aware of your surroundings and the greater world. Like that's all that wokeness was like, it's good to be read in and active and an activist if you can be. That's all that wokeness was. But now they've landed it on, if you want to know the real history of this country, then that's woke. You know what I mean? Where it's like, no, we should just know the history of this country. So I think that, it's right now it's wokeness and critical race theory. When that runs out of steam, it'll be something else. Every December we take a break and and the right wing does the war on Christmas, which is not a thing. So there's just like it's just really, the thing that's important is not getting caught up in thinking that thing is real. But the thing that is real is trying to squelch black intellectuals and black intellectualism. And so I've heard a lot of black academics on college campuses, talk about the fact that like it is now bled into the halls of academia, where you're supposed to be studying, where you're supposed to be promoting, where you're supposed to be talking about the painful parts of whatever your field is, the controversial parts, the parts that people don't talk about in high school. And so I believe that 99% of the right wing in this country who is trying to get critical race theory out of elementary schools knows that there's no critical race theory in elementary schools. But that is their way of saying, we don't want to teach history. So I think my job as a person who's sort of like in the media world is to do what I can to sort of like diffuse all that. Like we did a defund the police episode this season, just to go, you can be angry about it, but you should at least know what it is first.
That's right. And if you know history, then maybe you don't repeat history. And that is... Unless
history went well for you, then you do want to repeat it.
I guess so. I guess so. And that is the key. That's the key that I was so fascinated by. That it's about keeping the status quo, because it's too scary and too unimaginable to think about dismantling the structures that we live within that are probably really comfy for me and not necessarily quite comfy for you. And that is the key, right? And which I found so interesting. So that brings me to this. Are you conscious about trying to reach people that don't share our more progressive or liberal ideals and values? How do you do it?
I mean, I think that, the moment that I got a meeting at CNN to talk about, we have this idea for a TV show, we think you might work well for it. There is certainly a moment of like, when I was a little kid watching Eddie Murphy on Saturday Night Live, I wasn't going, one day I hope to have a TV show on CNN. Like that was not a thing. So there is a thing about like, how do I fit in here? At the time, Bourdain was there, and I was like, well, if he can do it, I mean, because he doesn't look to be afraid of anything, and I don't feel like he's gotten softer since he's come to CNN, then I feel like I can do what I want to do. So I am aware that the audience is not always on the same page as me, but part of my job is to go look at it through this lens. Like I understand and sort of go, and you'll even hear me in the show sometimes in VO, I'm talking to the general audience. Sometimes I'm talking to a specific audience. And sometimes that can be black people. It can be white people. It can be Asian people if we're doing an episode about the Hmong community in Minneapolis, St. Paul. So I think I'm very aware of like, I'm not always talking to the same group throughout the whole episode, but I do, but I'm also not trying to make it so simple that people who know these issues are like, this is boring. So there's a delicate balance that you have to take. But I enjoy walking that, and I love hearing from people who go, I'm a 72-year-old conservative from Nebraska, and I don't agree with anything you say, but I do like your show. Like it's yeah,
that's great.
Yeah.
I'll take it. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
you take it. You'd like people to maybe change their views, but that's not necessarily possible if you're a realist. The final thing I wanted to talk about with what your show does, and it was said so perfectly in this episode, was about how a lot of Americans believe their own hype. And that's also a uniquely Pittsburghian thing. I don't even know if that's the right phrase to use for people from Pittsburgh.
Pittsburghers.
There you go. There you go. But like for me, I'm not American, and so I am very conscious of how Americans do believe their own hype, and that is probably holding them back from improvement and making changes. That's something that I think comes through your show quite a bit, in a very nuanced way. Were you happy about really shining a light on that particular concept?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some sense, when I look at like what the show is, I think it's a little bit like, I don't think we all took the same civics classes in elementary school where you get to learn about how the country came to be and how it works. And I don't know that I paid attention during civics classes in elementary school or high school. So for me, this is also about educating myself. And I know I'm a reasonably smart person, but if I'm getting educated, then there's somebody in the audience who's getting educated. So for me, it is a thing that I'm excited to, when I'm sitting across from somebody in an interview and I go, oh, I didn't know that, or wow, somebody at home, some percentage of people at home is doing the same thing. And that feels like something we want to share. So I do think that it is about like, I don't think we've all collectively looked at America honestly. And part of United States of America is like, let's look at it honestly. Let's be clear about what it is.
Yeah. The show started airing in 2016. That happened to be when Trump took office. It's still going. Last season, you explored things like Venezuelans in South Florida, Iranian Americans, reparations, the gig economy, like really interesting stuff. Now that the Trump administration is over and we're in a new administration, people have, it's like, that's fantastic, but people have also realized that wasn't the big solution, just having him gone, because things are still pretty messy. What do you look forward to? Are you thinking about what other topics and things that you want to spotlight going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think like a lot of people, I look at America right now as being at a crossroads. Like, I compare it to a nightclub. Like there's Studio 54 was the hip nightclub in New York for a long time. You can walk past that building and it says Studio 54 on it, but ain't nobody going there for a nightclub. No. And I think America's in danger of we'll still be called the United States of America, but we're not going to mean the same thing. We've already lost a lot of that, as you can tell me from where you are on the globe. And I think at this crossroads, we can either decide to double back and fix it and clean this nightclub up and sort of like still keep it where it's at, or we could lose it. And I think with all the problems we have in this country, I don't even know if it's a 50-50 shot now. I think it's like there's just a lot of it's going to take a lot of strong will and new ideas, and we're not quite at the place where the strong-willed new ideas people are at high enough levels of power. But they're getting there. We're getting a few of those in, but we need more.
That's right. And so it's always good to be positive, I suppose. And also that's true.
Oh, is that positive? I didn't mean to be positive. It's
I like it. Come on, we've got to hold on to the positivity.
Okay.
I think a true patriot is someone who can look at their lot in life and their country and see how things can be improved, so it's better for everyone. So on that note, Kamau, I want to really thank you for your time today. What a fascinating interview and a great show, and good luck at the Emmys. I reckon you can take down Tucci. I reckon you can take down Oprah. It's a done deal, man.
I would never take down Oprah. I might win an award that she doesn't win, but I would never take down Oprah.